Okay, this is a nice report, a nice analysis. It got some opposition from somebody at a meeting where this was presented. It's prepared by a research non-governmental organization, let's say, called Sustainable Futures Collaborative. And you can see some heat maps here with temperature ranges, and basically it's about India's heat action plans. Is India ready for a warming world? How heat resilience measures are being implemented for 11% of India's urban population in some of its most at-risk cities. So I'm going to be brief. There's a nice report, about 40 pages, 42 pages. I'm going to take just the most important points, the abstract, and then the executive summary, and then we'll look at a couple of additional figures from the main text. So this is the first assessment of the implementation of extreme heat policies in multiple cities in India using an ensemble of climate models from CMIP-6. It focuses on just over 11% of India's urban population as per the census of 2011. The next census hasn't happened yet. I think it's just being planned. And this is in some of India's most at-risk cities to future heat as climate warms. So CMIP-6 models 1.5 degrees C warming, what it looks like for distribution of heat waves over India, and how India's heat action plans, resilience plans, stack up for these at-risk cities of for future heat. Through interviews with 88 government officials in disaster management, health, city planning, and labor departments, as well as city and district administrators, we find that while all cities reported implementing short-term response measures to prevent the loss of lives during heat waves, there was a significant gap in their long-term preparedness for future heat. We will look at some barriers and where the demand for action came from and so on. Inconsistent and weakly targeted long-term heat actions suggest that India will likely see heat waves with higher mortality levels more frequently in the coming years as short-term life-saving responses and communities' adaptive capacities are overwhelmed by rising temperatures. So there is a kind of a thing to worry about there, that India in the annual mean trend is actually not warming in many places, and in fact cooling even during 2023, which was one of the warmest years in record, I think the warmest year so far. India was cooler over large parts, but this doesn't mean we are not getting heat waves. Okay, we show that this pattern of policy implementation arises because of a mix of weakly institutionalized heat action plans, limited public support for long-term measures, and an interconnected set of institutional constraints based on which we identify policy recommendations to make ongoing heat actions more responsive to future heat. So future heat from CMIP-6 at local scales obviously have lots of uncertainties, but risk is there and we have to prepare. So this is kind of the map here going from, you can see the color codes behind. Ludhiana, Meerut, New Delhi, Faridabad. New Delhi gets lots of attention every year because of pollution during the winter and then heat waves during the spring, which is our heat wave season. Here is Gwalior, Kota in Rajasthan, Surat in Gujarat, Mumbai in Maharashtra, West Coast, and Bengaluru down here in Karnataka. What is the executive summary? In this report, we study the implementation of policies and actions aimed at reducing extreme heat risks in 9 Indian cities in 9 states, covering a little over 11% of India's suburban population. We picked these cities based on how vulnerable they were to increases in extreme heat events as the planet warms. Using CMIP-6 climate model output, we established which Indian cities with a population of over 1 million according to the census of 2011 would experience some of the greatest increases in days with dangerous heat index values, a measure of the combined effect of temperature and humidity, which is the heat risk or heat stress, compared to the historical average. Rapid shifts in the extreme heat index distribution induced by climate change may overwhelm communities' adaptive capacity and lead to substantial increases in heat attributable mortality and morbidity. This study is particularly urgent given the recent indications that climate may be warming faster than previously anticipated. CMIP 6, in case you don't know what that is, I have lots of podcasts on the IPCC assessment report 6 that trickled out during 21-22 in the during and after COVID, delayed a little bit and so on. What is the approach they took? We conducted 88 interviews with city, district and state government officials charged with implementing heat actions in these 9 cities. Because heat adaptation requires a coordinated cross-sectoral response, we conducted interviews with representatives of disaster management, health, city planning and labor departments, as well as city and district administrators, as we said in the abstract, to assess how prepared these cities are for extreme heat in the coming decades. We catalogued short-term measures meant to save lives while paying special attention to heat solutions that are thought to bring long-term benefits. The latter include changes to urban form and the built environment, expanding urban tree cover, reducing density by increasing open space with building setbacks and parks, and changing design norms for heat-trapping buildings, and improvements in institutions that manage heat risk, from capacity building efforts for government officials to the mandatory reporting of heat deaths to higher levels of government. Many of these actions take years to mature through refinement before they improve lives on the ground. Essentially, it's to go beyond crisis management mode. India is doing very well on early warnings, and National Disaster Management Agency, in coordination with local agencies, does fairly well, but there are still mortalities and of course morbidities, labor productivity, capacity, availability losses, and of course gender-based impacts, age-based impacts and so on. And the idea is to build resilience so that you are not just dealing with crises when heat waves come, but actually are prepared to the warming that will continue, the heat waves that will continue to increase in duration, intensity and frequency. Plus, you want to mainstream these into the budget so that you have room to maintain these resilience building activities in a sustained fashion, and that's always the most tricky part. This is the first study to assess the implementation of extreme heat policies and actions across multiple cities in India. This study is novel in its focus on long-term policies and their implementation challenges. We believe the issues and patterns highlighted in this report will be useful to cities in India and elsewhere that are attempting to complement their short-term responses with long-term heat risk mitigation through structural and institutional responses. What are the findings? All cities report short-term emergency measures, which is good news. These include actions like access to drinking water, changing work schedules, and boosting hospital capacity before or during a heat wave. If these measures are being implemented correctly, verification of which is beyond the scope of this study, this could read as a positive story in achieving a minimum baseline of life-saving actions across cities in just over a decade since India's first Heat Action Plan (HAP) was published in 2013. Long-term actions are focused on the health system. Long-term solutions meant to reduce the mounting cumulative risk of heat waves due to global warming were most commonly reported for the health system. As a result, what emerges is a picture of very weak mainstreaming of long-term heat concerns in other crucially important sectors. Health system preparedness, while foundationally important to heat resilience, is meant to deal with the consequences of heat overwhelming the adaptive capacity of societies rather than prevent such situations from occurring. So you are not, it's globally forced system with some local amplifiers, and the local amplifiers need to be dealt with in terms of adaptation and mitigation, preparedness, etc. as a long-term strategy. A significant proportion of reported long-term actions are poorly targeted. Long-term solutions were both less common and less likely to be effective because they were not targeted at heat vulnerable populations. Actions such as the expansion of urban shade and green cover, the creation of open spaces that dissipate heat, and the deployment of, among others, of the deployment of I screwed that up. Give me a second. I cut off something there. Sorry about that. Let me pause. Yeah, so I chopped off unintentionally an important line there. It happens when you're doing cut and paste for preparing these podcasts. So let's read it again. A significant proportion of reported long-term actions are poorly targeted. Long-term solutions were both less common and less likely to be effective because they were not targeted at heat-vulnerable populations. Actions such as the expansion of urban shade and green cover, the creation of open spaces that dissipate heat, and the deployment of rooftop solar that could help with active cooling, among others, were driven by the developmental objectives of existing sectoral programs without adequate attention to populations and areas that experience greatest health risk. So there is always the economic development and habitability or housing availability favorable to businesses or whatever. So paying attention to even within a city boundary, the vulnerable populations is not always automatic. So you have to pay special attention to that, and obviously that's not been done carefully enough. Many important long-term actions are entirely absent. These include making household or occupational cooling available to the most heat exposed, developing insurance cover for lost work, expanding fire management services for heat waves, and electricity grid retrofits to improve transmission reliability and distribution safety. Other foundational actions such as the expansion of local weather stations for more granular data on heat variation within a city, mapping urban heat islands, and training heat plan implementers were only seen in some cities. The next step is short-term actions that are expensive. The shift towards long-term climate adaptation will require more finance, in terms of even mainstreaming them into fiscal policies and budgets. Over 2/3 of respondents reported adequate funding for heat actions that they were drawing from a diverse range of existing sources spanning local, state, and national funds. This is a consequence of a focus on short-term actions that are relatively inexpensive and temporary. Long-term structural changes such as those mentioned above will require dedicated financial resources. When you have a central government sitting on a lot of the tax rupees, and it has to distribute and protect the states, and you have, let's say, a future projection of where it's a zero-sum game, so resources are limited. So how do you allocate funds based on projected information for where you may need prioritized heat wave action plans in the longer term, resilience building, etc. That's a very tricky situation. Based on this distribution of inconsistent and weakly targeted long-term heat actions in our sample, India will likely see heat waves with higher mortality levels more frequently in the coming years as short-term life-saving responses and communities' adaptive capacities are overwhelmed by rising temperatures, which we already said. So let's look at this figure here. First read the caption. Reported heat actions with 150 solutions in number largely focus on short-term actions, while a significant proportion with potential long-run benefits fall in the incidental category, meaning they do not target areas or populations at highest risk. Intentional actions are few and sporadic when health system measures which are meant to deal with the effects of a heat wave rather than reduce their initial impact are removed. The figure in the diagram below that we'll look at represent the number of cities out of 9 in which action is observed. So distribution of reported heat actions across 9 cities. There are these short-term ones and long-term intentional and long-term incidental. Okay, so you have various numbers here. Power, let's see, I didn't read the entire text. I didn't include the entire text in here. So let's just look at the various items in the actions. Awareness campaigns, hospital cooling wards, cooling centers, working hour change for outdoor workers, shade for workers, water for workers, animal livestock protection, water sprinkling on the road, office timing, power and shade in public spaces, and so on. Long-term intentional health staff training, training for implementers, urban heat island mapping, cool roofs, vulnerability assessment, automatic weather station, death surveillance, forest fire management, trees, cool roofs, we already mentioned, and in the long term, incidentally, you have trees, so you may have done it for other reasons. Open spaces, again done for other urban development kind of items. Rainwater harvesting, maybe focused on water and not heat action. Health insurance, water body rejuvenation, and rooftop solar. Okay, so it just gives you a sense of how they have mapped heat actions that do exist into short-term, long-term, and long-term intentional and incidental. So it gives you a sense. If you want further details, you can go back and read the report. It's relatively short, in fact, just about 42 pages. In our interviews with policymakers and implementers, we found that this distribution of heat action was driven by the following factors. Guidelines and directives from higher levels of the government drive short-term response measures. Heat action plans seem to have a weaker effect on policy. So the central government sets up programs like One Health and requirements on heat action plan and so on, and coordination with the National Disaster Management Agency, and of course there is a lot of investment in improving weather and climate forecasts and early warnings and so on. IMD, the India Meteorological Department, issues lots of alerts, warnings, and so on, etc. So heat action plans often contain long-term measures, but they seem to have a weaker effect on shaping the range and scope of heat actions because they are weakly institutionalized. Right, you need a complete line of command from where the guidelines come from, how the heat action plans are prepared, and how they are actually implemented. Public demand focuses on short-term action, so heat waves come every year. People want reducing immediate impacts through short-term actions, and they are not always aware that being ready with long-term resilience plans actually makes it easier for themselves to deal with heat waves, because they will be given all these long-term solutions such as trees and solar and open spaces, water bodies, and people who are trained to deal with the emergency and so on. Institutional constraints limit the possibility for long-term action. The top problem identified by respondents was coordination between government departments, both within and between municipal, district, and state government departments. Over half of all responses identified an interlinked mix of personnel shortages, competing priorities, weak technical capacity, and insufficient acknowledgement of the heat problem as constraints. So whether the new jobs have to be created, whether new extension agents are needed, or if there is already enough workforce that just needs to be trained and so on, are issues that are not addressed here. What are the barriers to heat action by sector? These are the sectors: coordination failures, staff crunch, lack of mandate, competing priorities, weak technical capacity, do not see heat as a problem, or just inadequate finance. So among all responses and disaster management, district, city administrators, urban development and planning authorities, labor and health, there were various deficiencies or barriers in terms of heat action. Okay, so this is the coordination problem, which emerged as the single largest institutional constraint, followed by compelling priorities limiting the focus on heat. A substantial portion of implementers did not see heat as a policy problem. Rows represent department types interviewed in 9 cities. Brackets contain responses per department, and I won't go into the details, but you get a sense that there are many problems that add up to having barriers in effective and efficient heat wave action. What are the policy recommendations coming out of this study then? Institutional challenges: strengthen heat action plans in local governments. Seems obvious, and yet it's very critical that national or state public finance are allocated towards long-term risk mitigation efforts. So it isn't always clear whether the central government has this figured out already. It's one thing to mandate that states prepare and cities prepare heat action plans, and is another to offer the resources. Sometimes cities go and borrow from the World Bank or other development banks to get things done, but this depends on many details on how the state itself is being run. Draw on disaster mitigation funds that provide for extreme heat risk mitigation. So that's another item that will require boosting technical capacity in local governments to design and execute effective projects. There's lots of corruption issues, which I don't think this report gets into, or will get into it. Heat officers need appropriate institutional backing. So nascent conversations about creating chief heat officer type positions should also consider how to equip them with adequate authority to solve the underlying institutional problems we have identified. India has done very well. If you look at cyclone disaster management, India has done tremendously well. The number of deaths or mortality overall by cyclones is reduced tremendously in about 20 years or 15 years, and that hasn't translated to heat wave, because as the report says, many don't see heat wave as a serious policy problem, or they just see it as a short-term disaster management problem and not as a long-term resilience building problem. Capacity building, then create targeted capacity building program for heat action plan implementation across India's most heat vulnerable cities. So it has to be starting with a small group with high potential impact and expanding over time to others. Has to be sustained multi-year capacity building effort, and where the expertise will come from, whether it will be provided by the central government or it will be given to each state, and how it will be set up and sustained, they're all tricky issues as well. Establish trained disaster management support staff capacity at district and city level. This is going well, as I said, for cyclone management, but it needs to be dealt with at local levels. Cyclone is a big disaster that is coming at you, and people know it's deadly. Heat wave, sometimes people just underestimate. Let's say a farmer is not aware, or old people are not aware, and in fact it has happened that old people have been exposed to a heat wave because somebody, the organizer, let's say, didn't know of a warning that was already out there about heat waves, and there was a shameful number of dead people out of that event. So such gaps have to be closed. In terms of technology recommendations, create a highly targeted active cooling program. This of course needs some kind of a distributed system that covers all the scales. The rapid increase in temperatures and massive gap in long-term heat resilience strongly suggests that at-risk urban populations will turn to air conditioning to protect their lives, but it has, of course, obvious as it is, it's not always clear how to do it. Governments must also invest in ongoing R&D efforts to scale next generation cooling technologies while investing in transmission and distribution infrastructure and renewable energy expansion. This program must complement existing efforts at passive cooling, which will play a pivotal role in reducing air conditioning usage times. So air conditioning, even if you make it very clean and not a greenhouse gas emitting unit, you will still want energy, and even if you have a lot of renewable energy, intermittency has to be dealt with. You cannot run peaker plants on coal, for example. So this is a serious problem in terms of active cooling program. Secondly, use climate projections to inform implementers about the future heat impacts and expand the scope of solutions. This is tricky because you can take 1.5 degrees C global warming and try to produce local heat wave risk maps, and there are uncertainties, and again it becomes critical to decide how the resources will be distributed, considering there are only limited resources. Looking at some further figures from the report, percentage increase in extreme heat index days for each place in space in heat at in space in India at 1.5 degrees C. There are uncertainties here, but we know that heat waves have already kind of moved towards this. There are related studies arguing that this is related to external forcing like Middle East warming, shifting the winds and so on. But you can see the increase in exceedance frequency of historical 98th percentile heat index is here. So this is a hot spot here. We already looked at Ludhiana, Meerut, New Delhi, Faridabad, Gwalior, and Mumbai is getting more heat waves. Maybe this has to be looked at because this is now part of this shift to northwest as well. Bengaluru is there, urbanization, urban heat island, everything comes together. So they looked at 9 cities in 9 states, home to 42.7 million people as per census of 2011. Obviously it's very old by now because it's almost 14-15 years old, so this number has gone up quite a bit, I'm sure. Okay, so this is the variation in heat action across cities. So you can see short-term, long-term intentional and long-term incidental. Most of them are focused on short-term, even though Surat, for example, has done well on dealing with health effects as well in terms of enteric fever and so on. So they have somehow allocated a larger proportion to long-term intentional and incidental measures. But you can see that most of the other cities are mostly focused on short-term. Okay, Mumbai does well in terms of intentional long-term planning as well. Financial constraints, lot of reported constraints are saying here adequate funding, some funding but inadequate, and no funding reported. So that's just to give you an indication of the barriers that are there for implementing short or long-term plans. Reported sources of funding: departmental budget, state government, central government, private finance, finance commission funding, multilateral development banks, and unknown sources. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there are cities which are part of the global what is it called, urban resilience programs, where they have gone off on their own to do things with borrowing money from development banks. Barriers to heat action plan, we already looked at this a little bit in terms of failures in coordination, competing priorities, not seeing heat as a problem, staff crunch, lack of mandate, weak technical capacities and inadequate finances. And looking at different cities, they have different kinds of barriers to action, and it's a nice study in terms of just taking the survey and then splitting them into these sectors where failures are happening. So I kind of been very brief about this, but still it's about 29 minutes. You should go and read the report. I liked it only because this is the first of such study. As I said, somebody jumped up and down and had some objections, but I think this is very useful information, so I decided to put it out on my channel here as a podcast. Okay, see you in the next topic.